Hey Snapchat. For last week I've been talking about a pretty heavy topic, boards. Today I'm going to talk about how to be a more effective communicator. And if I'm looking tired, it's because I haven't yet had my morning cup of Joe. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of that while we speak. In undergrad, I took 2 degrees, economics and political science, and I've told everyone that political science was way more valuable to me. I'm going to tell you why. While understanding supply and demand curves and how consumers interact, of course, is critical to what I do as a VC, being a good communicator is even more critical. What political science taught me was taking a lot of vague information and distilling it into a cogent argument. And it forced me to write papers on a regular basis, and the papers had to have a thesis and supporting arguments. And this forms the basis of almost all of my work. Everything I do, phone calls, board meetings, partner meetings, I think in terms of thesis and supporting arguments. The metaphor that I've tried to use to help others to think through this is boxes. You need to put things in boxes. Because the most difficult thing, especially in today's era, is there's so much information and data around, and how do you actually classify and organize this? When I started my career, I used to take data and I would try to organize data, lots of it, and then form an argument. I call that bottom up. The problem is that I got lost reading and interpreting data. I wasted way too much time trying to figure out what the data was telling me. My favorite mentor in strategy consulting, Amit Shah, told me to form an argument, develop a thesis, and then get the data to prove or disprove the thesis. This kind of approach is called top-down thinking. Top-down thinking, you can't be intellectually lazy. If the data doesn't support your thesis needs to change. The way I initially mastered it was a book taught at both McKinsey and Anderson Consulting called The Pyramid Principle by Barbara Minto. Minto said that you should have a main argument supported by just 3 sub-arguments, and then these themselves form sub-sub-arguments. And the truth is that most people can't handle complex arguments, so by putting things into 3s, you help build stronger cases and get more support. To make this real, I'm going to try an example in real time to try and show you how I use this, even just in my daily life, to form arguments. In yesterday's Wall Street Journal was an article about John Doerr and Kleiner Perkins and how he's handed the baton to the next generation of leaders. John Doerr has been amongst the most successful VCs in our industry, and yet over the last few years there's been a lot of calls for him to find the next generation. So how should I think about this? And if I had to make a presentation, let's say to my partners on this article and what I think about it, how would I form an argument? You'll remember I told you it was about boxes. Here's my first box, my thesis. Great VCs build teams and think through succession planning. In building my thought process, I would start by saying strong leaders build great firms. They drive strategy, culture, and people. Often my second part of the argument is what I might call the but. But markets and technology change and new talents emerges, and that's going to be the second part of my argument. Third part of my argument, winners hand the baton off and others are disrupted. Now I'm doing this in real time. Great VCs build teams and think through succession planning. They have strong leaders, but markets change, winners hand the baton off. Perhaps if I had more time, I would start to change my argument, but you can see even just putting boundaries and definitions makes it easier to be a great communicator. Now I can begin to gather some data and look at places that are on their generation 2 or 3 to try and see if these places had strong leaders initially. And places where their generation 1 are contemporaries of mine, First Round Capital, True Venture, Spark, and I know they have strong leaders, teams, and culture. But markets change and technology changes. We saw the PC shift to the internet, Web 1.0 shifted to social. We saw winners like Facebook and Twitter. If I'm supporting my thesis, it should say that some of these firms made the transition and other people didn't. A really big theme we talk about it up front is the shift from software only to hardware plus software. We think that's one of the big trends that's changed in the market. And we've looked at some of the firms we really respect, like True Ventures or Foundry Group, that have made this transition and done really successful investments. And we ourselves, 5 years ago, started doing more. Winners hand the baton, others are disrupted. Now I want to go through some old firms that were disrupted. The thesis is the younger partners usually leave. And I've already talked about some great firms, Sequoia XL, Greylock, that have had succession plans. But there's also some new firms. People don't talk about it quite as much. DFJ is a firm that I think has successfully handed the baton to the next generation of leaders, and I think that's going to leave them in really good stead. Okay, I got to move outside here. Family's woken up, breakfast time. They're going to start turning on television, so I'm relegated outside. On this idea of succession planning in 2011, my founder, Eve Cisterone, and I began talking about this idea of a transition. We agreed that Eve and I would be co-managing partners, but I would drive strategy, culture, and future team. Because I think so much about team, we brought on two fantastic partners, Greg Bettinelli and Kara Nortman, that have already started to change our culture and strategy. I brought on board a chief operating partner who's a true partner and helps us actually run the day-to-day business of Upfront Ventures. And we groomed two younger professionals from associate to principal and now let Kevin Zhang and Jordan Hudson both make investments. Remember, my lesson today is how to form a thesis and create supporting arguments and then get data to prove or disprove those. By forming a thesis and putting sub-arguments into boxes, it will help you to be a better communicator and get decisions made that you want other people to. And you can use top-down thinking to think about how you think about arguments and to help you think through topics like I've just done here with Kleiner Perkins and John Doerr's transition. And I promise you, this is how I start virtually every piece of work that I'm doing, putting it into boxes, trying to think about how I think about an argument. The key is I do it before I have all the information, and I try to form an argument, and if I'm not forming a cogent argument, I go get more information. It's a really hard thing to learn, how to start with answers, and I think it discombobulates people, but I promise you it's more productive.